And so either we are incredibly evil for having children, or life is worth the opportunity to make that choice. You can't have it both ways. And of course, again, that's ignoring just the fundamental, what I would consider a flaw in the question in the first place, which is you can't have the existence of a God that produced a heaven and a hell or eternal destruction or any of those things. You can't have the existence of that God and simultaneously take a position of moral superiority from which to evaluate that God. And I think honestly for me that's like a big problem with a lot of what I see in deconstruction is a lot of what happens in deconstruction. And I'm not saying that this is the creator who asked this question. I'm just saying in general, right? One of the problems I see in deconstruction is that a lot of it seems to be people evaluating the morality or their perceived morality of God and then determining that, well, if that is who that God is, I would never follow them, right? Or determining, well, that God doesn't sound like a good God, and therefore he doesn't exist because what I believe God is something better than what I read there, right? And so that's kind of like the general thinking that I find, unfortunately, within a lot of deconstruction. Now, some of it is actually like evidentiary or historically based. They go and they look into the history of the Bible, they look into the history of Jesus, things like that. And at a historical level, they conclude that they just don't believe the evidence, stacks up. And fair enough, right? Like each person has to make that evaluation themselves. And I think that's fine. But when somebody is evaluating whether to believe in or serve God based on whether they agree with the moral frameworks of that God, that is incredibly problematic. And here's the reason why. The only question that actually matters is, does that God exist and is he who he says he is? That's the only question that matters. Because if the God of the Bible actually exists, right? Let's say that the evidence stacks up, the evidence for the God of Isaac and Jacob and so on, and the evidence of Jesus being who he said he was. Let's say that, at an evidentiary level, you come to the conclusion that that God exists. Then it really doesn't matter whether you agree with his moral frameworks, because you immediately have to take the position of a entirely inferior being with an entirely inferior point of view, and you have to take a position of the learner, accepting that you have to be taught and brought up to an elevated position of understanding, because your starting point is so far apart from that being. It would be laughable to evaluate him according to his frameworks from your human perspective. And this would be true of any religion. It doesn't matter, Buddhism, Hinduism, Muslim, Islam, whatever. It doesn't matter, right? Christianity isn't unique in this. This is for anybody who is looking for or trying to determine whether God exists. The evaluation of that God's quote unquote like expressed moral framework is a terrible starting position to try and evaluate whether you believe that God exists. What you need to be looking at is the evidence for their existence. You need to be looking at like historical information that suggests whether or not this God exists, right? Like one of the things for me that I found compelling, outside of just the evidence for Jesus being who he said he was, is that the Bible has a unique continuity across all of the writings that I just have not seen in other books, right? Like there's a continuity in there that kind of underlies everything that it's not obvious until you just read a lot of it. And then as you read a lot of it, there's just this, it seems like what I would call like an impossible continuity, right? Now, for me, that was a type of evidence. Now, not everybody is going to be compelled by that evidence. Some people are going to find, that to be not sufficient, and they need different evidence. Fair enough, right? My point is that you shouldn't be evaluating the moral frameworks or evaluating what like your perception of the goodness of or the morality of a particular God before resolving the question of whether you even believe that God exists in the first place. Like the starting point is, does the evidence suggest that this God is actually real? Because if he's not, then anything written in the book about or from that God is completely irrelevant. And if he is, then your opinion on it is completely irrelevant. So anyway, those are my thoughts on that topic. Todd, if you happen to see this, just to be very clear, I was not trying to call you out at all in any way, shape, or form. I'd just seen that question a lot, and I saw you ask it. I actually was going to try and stitch you, but I couldn't stitch the video. So, but I'm going to tag you in this just because one of the points that you made is that everybody kind of like goes right to free will, and you felt like that was kind of a trite answer. You didn't necessarily use those words, but I agree with you. Like from my perspective, I also think free will is kind of a cop out. I think there's relevance to it in this question, but it's part of a there's like a much larger conversation there. Like free will, just be like, oh, it's just free will. Like that's a cop out, right? So I wanted to post this, and if you find this answer interesting or useful, and you want to respond, let's not get into like a video back and forth. Like shoot me a DM and let's have a conversation. I'd much rather like actually talk than get into like some kind of TikTok back and forth. I hate that stuff. It's not, I'm not here to debate, right? So I just wanted to put my thoughts out there, and hopefully this helps anybody else who has this question maybe think about this question through a different lens, and maybe ask the question like, what is really the underlying question that you're asking here? Like, what are you actually trying to get at? Because if you're evaluating Christianity as to whether or not like you want to be a Christian, well, the first question is, does this God exist at all, right? Like, is there sufficient evidence that this God exists? I think that needs to be the starting point. And if you're evaluating it basically just to like disprove Christians, then it's like, to what end? Like, if you don't believe that God exists, then who cares? You know what I mean? It's like, I don't believe Santa Claus exists, so I'm not going to argue with a 5-year-old about whether Santa Claus exists and present all the proofs about why they're wrong. It's like, that Santa Claus doesn't exist. Who cares? You know what I mean? So, if you're in a place where you're asking this question, I might encourage you just to really like, check your internal reasoning for like, why are you asking the question? Are you actually trying to understand God, right? Or are you trying to evaluate God from a morally superior position because you feel that the expressed ethics of that God aren't lining up with who he is? And now you have a good question, but the posture from which you're asking the question is irrational, right? And so these are the types of things that I just think are important to think about when we're exploring these type of topics. And I'm saying all this because this is what I had to do. Like anytime I encounter these types of questions, I also have to do the same thing. I have to take a pause and go, from what position am I evaluating this question? And is that position actually a rational position from which to evaluate it, right? And so all of those things I think are useful and valuable. So anyway, we'll see you next time. Shh.